Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of the IFoEC podcast. We're delighted to be joined by Dr. Dylan Poulus today, and we're going to be talking all about his background, his work, and the subject of stress and coping within esports. Let's go straight to you. Dylan, please maybe say a few words about yourself and where you're currently at and what you do.
Hi, Matt. Hi, Kabir. It's really exciting to have a chat with you today. I'm currently a lecturer at the Southern Cross University in Queensland, the Gold Coast in Australia, where 5 minutes walk from the beach. It's a bit of a paradise. I'm very lucky to work where I work. I'm even luckier that Southern Cross supports me as a lecturer to continue to do research like the research I did in my PhD on kind of the psychological determinants of success in esports and what that looks like at that really cutting edge high level. And they're also supporting me to evolve my kind of research program and look into the mental health, say, benefits or negatives of playing esports, because at that broader level, we don't really know what the effects of esport participation are on the people who play the games. So, yeah, I mean, my life really is 50-50 teaching into our psychology program here at Southern Cross, and then the other 50% is the esports research.
Brilliant. So, where Southern Cross? Where in Australia is that?
It's a very south corner of Queensland.
Right.
So, if we had a map, I could really quickly point it out, but we don't. If anyone listening wants to have a look and type in Gold Coast, Queensland, especially those of you who, might be interested in maybe studying a PhD one day. Should I ever advertise the opportunity to come and work with me at Southern Cross? If you're on the fence, hopefully having a look at some of those beautiful white beaches will be the thing that gets you over the line to come and study with us.
100%. I studied 1 year in Wollongong, so beaches were nice, very nice, but I never made it up to Queensland, and I didn't do too much exploring, but a wonderful place to study for sure. So Dylan, let's maybe take it back as far as we can. When did gaming sort of become an aspect of your life? When did it sort of transition from just a hobby or something you were aware of into a focus of your work here?
Yeah, so this is an interesting story, and one that has big pauses in it. And hopefully the big pause that I do talk about in a second really illustrates why I'm so passionate about supporting esports now. And I've really devoted the last 5 years of my life to esports and plan to devote the next 15 to esports as well. Mum and Dad always said that one of the biggest mistakes they ever made was buying me and my brothers an Xbox. That was our doorway into esports. I wasn't necessarily very good, and that's still very much the case. I'm very much a casual competitive player. But we were really into kind of our Halo and then our Call of Duty when it came out, and a bit of GoldenEye, way back when, showing how old I am. And one thing, I loved this. I absolutely loved the connection that I formed with my brothers over playing this game, and anyone else at school through playing this game. We were always sharing tips, and when we could, all of our birthday parties were LAN parties where we'd all bring the Xboxes together. And that sounds like something that's really easy to do now to today's current generation, but that was a mission back when I was young, getting all that set up and finding a parent who would support us to do that. And so that was my introduction into games. Like, oh my God, I love this. I'm making all of my friends through this, and I'm actually feeling quite competent at this, and it gives me something to strive for and get better in. And that was really starkly contrasted for me with my traditional sport participation. So for people listening around the world, almost everyone is kind of pushed into playing sports as a young person here. You get into rugby, cricket, soccer. If you're near the beach, it's kind of surfing and water sports. And it's really like, this is what we do after school. Everyone plays a sport, some extracurricular activity. And I loved cricket. I was really passionate about cricket. It gave me everything esports gave me in that kind of competence and friendship group. And with cricket, I had every avenue. I wanted, supported by the government, my local club, whoever it was, to see how good I could get at cricket. And again, I wasn't very good at cricket. I'm still not. But from Milo cricket, which is our kind of you're 5 years old and you're still figuring out how the game works. From that level of cricket all the way up to playing for Australia, There was a step-by-step progression, a coaching manual, someone who could train you to be better. Contrast that with my esports involvement when I was a young person. There was nothing. There was a few professional orgs that were making cool videos on YouTube, but there was no structured pathway. There was no support. There was no kind of national acceptance. And so that was my adolescence with games. And when I got to about 16, you kind of get that, or I had that from mum and dad and my friends. It was like time to put the games down and finish high school and get into uni. And if you want to be good at sports, well, now's when you really focus on that and try to get a scholarship. And so games kind of stopped for me then. After being such a huge part of my life, the Xbox was put away and that was it. Until I was studying psychology as an undergraduate student, and suddenly all the games that I really loved when I was young were still around, because I just disconnected from the industry, but they were still around. And in fact, there were clubs at university, and they were all fighting with each other. All the clubs, the Dota club and the LoL club and the Counter-Strike club, they were all fighting with each other for resources, i.e. the university's support. Like, no, we've got more people in LoL than we do in Dota, so we should get more funding. And I combined with another person who is now a esports academic, Dr. Michael Trotter, who was an undergraduate student. That's when we met, and we combined forces at the time, and we said, if we just combined all these clubs and we got everyone to stop fighting and everyone to work together, we could really get some serious university resources, and we could really bring together something special that benefits all gamers. It's that traditional, the sum of the parts is more, is more than the parts on their own. I've butchered that, but you know what I mean, that greater than the something. I've got that all wrong, but that was really our core ethos, and that's what we did. And so that is the second coming of me into esports. I was finally able to bring these clubs together. I was able to give the young me that didn't have all the opportunities to build my networks as a young adult in esports and really find out, could I be good at this? Can I make all my friends through this? I didn't have that opportunity, and I had the opportunity with Michael to build that for the next generation in Australia. And so what we did, I realize I've been talking for a bit now, so cut me off if I need to stop. But what we did was we got all the esports clubs together, and I'm telling the abridged version here, but we formed QUT Esports. And if you were to Google QUT Esports now, you'll see that it's got a beautiful, flashy room with amazing Alienware computers and really fast refresh rate monitors and the best kit that you could buy. When it first started, it was Michael and I, hat in hand, going around to all the departments at the university asking, can we have some computers? Do you have a room that you don't need? Can you help us in any way? And we got little bits from everyone and we pulled it all together. And when we first opened the door for QUT Esports way back when, it was a storeroom with no window. At the time, the air conditioning was doing its best, but quite frankly, it wasn't working. We had 16 computers that we had caught from QUT throwing them in the bin. We'd caught them right before they got into the bin, and we'd set them up, and we put internet in. And I still remember Michael and I on the Sunday before we opened figuring out how to work a switch and set up, a Cisco switch to run our 16 computers. And we opened the doors, and within 6 weeks of opening the doors, we went from being a club that didn't exist to being the biggest recreation and sports club at the Queensland University of Tech. And so that was this whirlwind start for us, and we kept running. And after our first term of running, our first semester at QUT, the university came to us, and this is a real credit to the Queensland University of Technology. They said, if we put some serious money behind this, because clearly you have begged, borrow and stole everything you've put in this room, if we support you properly, what could we build? And what you see now when you Google QUT Esports is what we built after that first term and starting kind of in the dungeon of QUT. They really got behind us. They supported Michael and I to build that program. And we built it on 3 pillars: competition, community, and research. And so with the competition pillar, it was for kind of young me. It was that if I was 16, I'm in a high school team and I wanted to get into university and get a scholarship and see where my esports professional career could take me, could university be a stepping stone? And we built that. We were the first university in Australia to give out scholarships to come and study if you played high level League of Legends. We had a semi-professional team in our League of Legends circuit in Australia, and we built that. We had Tuesday night was Overwatch coaching, and Wednesday night was LOL coaching, and you had team A and B and C, and it was just like what you imagine your traditional sports club would look like. The room was full, everyone was connecting over their love of esports, and that was the second pillar, that connecting over the love of esports. It was our community, and Michael, he is the king of community. He brought everyone together like no one else can through his passion for esports. And we had, meet and greets, games night, free hours to come in and play in the arena. And that really just helped our community swell. In the same way that for traditional sports, people would kind of, go to the pub or the bar and watch their favorite sport team, passionate esport casual players and competitive players were coming to our arena, and we were putting on the Dota TI or LOL Worlds where it was a playoff where we'd inevitably watch the Oceanic team get destroyed. It was just this beautiful melting pot of competitive esports, and the community that makes esports so powerful that anyone listening to this today is likely a part of and goes, yeah, I totally get that. And then there was the third pillar. And this pillar has now consumed a lot more of my life than I thought it would. And that was research. And so we essentially at the start set that up for all the researchers on campus because we were a massive, tertiary university. We wanted to say, come and research us, like write some papers. And we didn't get any interest. And so then someone approached Michael and I and said, well, why don't you guys do it? You've just finished your psychology degree. Come and do some research. Come and do your master's and your PhD if you want. And the rest was history. I fell in love with research. I fell in love with understanding what makes one player better than the other player when mechanically they're indistinguishable. And so we both, Michael and I, jumped into our Masters of Research, which became our PhDs, and now we're published in esports, and that's kind of our goal now. That's all we do, Michael and I, is research esports independently and together, and we really see that as how we can make the most difference to esports in the shortest amount of time. In that, when governments make policy calls, and when Department of Educations make policy calls, and when the elite teams in the world make calls on how they're going to support their athletes, they need to base that off research. And so Michael and I were like, if we can be the ones to provide that research, we can help these governing bodies make these calls sooner and help more young people to live their esport dream, whether that's in their educational setting or as a professional. And so in a really abridged way, that's kind of led us to near enough the present day. And that's what really lit that passion for me in esports, seeing the power that it can have and the positive effects it can have on all those who are involved in it. And I really want to use my ability to do research to keep pushing that industry forward and helping it evolve.
Sensational. That's such a powerful story, and wonderful to hear how it sort of developed from ground up. Lots of places we can go from here, but aside from wanting to call you the Aristotle of esports, with the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. But
thank you. Someone had to get it right this interview.
A cheesy quote is I thrive on that. But I mean, would you if you like cast your mind back to when you were setting up just a room or just the idea, I mean, how much did you look outside of QUT for support? Well, I mean, this was early stages for sort of grassroots programs, I suppose, or like collegiate programs, probably anywhere. So was this just initiative, trial and error, or were there any other models out there at the time that helped?
So a big influence for us, and if you're still in the esports industry, huge shout out to Mark Depp at the University of California, Irvine. We noticed that just a year or two before us, they got scholarships in America, and what they were trying to do, which is so powerful and something I really think we need to do in Australia, is just like if you want to play basketball or NFL at the elite level in America, you have to go through your university scene. Like that's a stepping stone. In Australia, and I'm not sure what it's like in other parts of the world, but in Australia, the university scene isn't part of that direct pathway. And so when we saw that the University of California, Irvine was leading the charge and building university esports as part of that stepping stone alongside their other traditional sport programs, we thought, this doesn't happen in Australia. This is how we can really help people in their kind of formative years as young adults stay connected to their love of esports and develop themselves as people through their love of esports. And the way to do that is to make universities a part of the system as opposed to like a tangent on your way to being a professional. And so we reached out to Mark and we said, we're two kids from Australia who've got a bright idea. He's probably heard that 10,000 times, and he still gave us an hour of his time, all the advice he could. And that really, we adapted it because the Australian university system is really different to the American university system. But that was really kind of when we got our first bedrock, our first foundational set of ideas, other than just what we thought would be cool. And we had molded that and adapted that. And we were the first in Australia to do what we did. That's something I probably didn't highlight much in the story, was the resistance that we got. And if you're watching in a region and you're kind of thinking there's nothing like this in my university, and every time I bring it up, I keep getting kind of smacked back down, I didn't leave out the 99% of the conversations we had, Michael and I, with university administrators, sponsors, club people in traditional sporting clubs who went, that's silly, this will never be a real thing. And so please let my story, inspire you through those hard moments. We got told no more than I can remember. And it was those ones that said half yes and no, but here you can have this. It was the conglomeration of all those two that helped us actually build the program I just described to you. And so once we did this in Australia, and this is what could really motivate someone in another part of the world to do what we did. Once we did this in Australia, we were the first university-supported esports program in the country. They started to pop up like wildfire. Every other university didn't want to be left behind. And one thing we did was to help all of the local high schools in our area who would listen to us, help set them up with high school esports programs feeding into our competitions. So if you're a university administrator listening to this, that's a great way to get students to come to your university. And if you're a high school listening to this, know that there is a real opportunity for you to engage your young people through their love of esports. Get them to come to school, get them to engage in class, and get them to stay after. If they're not playing their traditional sports, they'll be playing their esports. Give them a facilitated, safe way to do that, and that community will thrive. And that's what we were able to set up. But it did really start, Matt, with that first couple of conversations with Mark Depp.
Incredible. Kabir, is anything springing to mind here?
Yeah, I think
ready to set up your own university team.
I would love to. We had something very similar back in high school for myself. So my school had worked. We had houses, and each house had 30 kids in the class per year. And my year was like the first big gaming year. And at lunchtime, so I was obviously a very sporty person. I would always go play basketball. But on the rainy days, we couldn't because we didn't have an indoor court. So on the rainy days, we used to get our computers, our little MacBook Pros, go into the IT room where the bandwidth was the best. And we used to have LANs. And all of us, like, we would get 5 people from one house, 5 people from the other house. And we would play like LAN League of Legends at lunch. And it got so competitive. It even became borderline to the point where we were VOD reviewing in class. So I probably could have got better grades. I probably could have got better grades in school if I didn't discover League of Legends. But hey, here we are. I guess I wanted to touch up on from this club to how it developed your research interests. You obviously are someone who's very fond of the psychology aspect of sport, and mental toughness is one of those big research interests. You've obviously displayed how mentally tough you are by pursuing and going through this project. But I just wanted to understand, why was this such a big interest for you?
So great question. I don't think I've actually ever answered this on a podcast like this, but I wanted to be a sports psychologist. I hinted at my love of cricket. I wanted to support the best athletes in the world to be 1% better when they were performing at the top level. I was like intellectually fascinated by how two people could be physically so similar, or even from the naked eye, one person could look so physically superior to someone, or even objectively with all of their kind of objective measures that contribute to performance in whatever sport we're talking about, but the underdog would win, or something would separate them that we couldn't see. And what was this? What was happening? It had to be something kind of between the ears. And so before I fell back in love with esports, my goal was to try and be a sports psychologist and work with traditional sport athletes, and fueled by that love of those little 1%ers in our psychology that enable us to do incredible things. And it was when we got kind of tapped on the shoulder and said there's no research in esports that I was like, well, hang on a minute. This is something I love. There's nothing that's been done here. And what's going to make the most impact to the most people in an industry at this point? So the club had been running for a couple of years at this point. I felt like I'd been given so much by the esports industry. I'd had hundreds of members, probably thousands of members come through and help make my dream a reality that was QUT Esports. I had a semi-professional team that was competing. We had high schools that were just chomping at the bit to come and play in our arena. And I was like, oh my God, this industry has given me so much. And I can give a little bit back to that if I can start producing high quality research that helps move the industry forward. That combined with I already had a love of high performance from a psychological perspective, and I just finished an undergrad in psychology. Like, it was just one of those things that you can never connect the dots looking forward, but looking back, the dots connect quite clearly. But at the time, it just felt like I was just being given gift after gift after gift, and I didn't want to squander them. And so that's how I made that, leap into, well, let's understand what makes the people who are winning worlds at LoL better than the people that just came second. Why does it always seem to come down to a fifth game? And why does one team have a little bit more in the tank compared to the other teams? And that's kind of what I was fascinated with then before I started my PhD. And it's only got worse now the more I've researched it.
Was that where you started in terms of topics? Was it? I remember long ago talking to you about. It seems like mental toughness, mental resilience was a big topic like 3 years ago, and then it's sort of not such a hot topic right now. But I think the definition of debate probably still exists. But was that the initial research area? Because nowadays I associate you with stress and coping and psychological demands. Is mental toughness, was that like the springboard?
Mental toughness was the springboard for me, and I think for a lot of the traditional sports people who have moved into esports, mental toughness is a real buzzword in traditional sport. It's been around for kind of 20 to 30 years, and its popularity increases and decreases. But inevitably, when you ask coaches or players or what makes the best rugby player, soccer player, swimmer, you name it, it's, well, they've got to be mentally tough or resilient. And so I thought that was a pretty good place to start, was to see, at the end of the day, we're not talking about cricket, rugby, soccer, LOL, Dota, Counter-Strike. We're talking about human beings trying to perform under pressure, and whether that's more physical, i.e. you're getting tackled by 120 kilo people into the ground, or it's less physical, i.e. you're making really complex decisions under extreme pressure with very limited information. And if you're talking Counter-Strike, something like reaction time is layered in there as well as being extremely important. What we're talking about is people performing under pressure. And if mental toughness was making such a huge difference, according to all the literature and everyone you speak to in traditional sports, I felt like it was a really interesting place to start when we're looking at esports. One of the earliest investigations I did that really kind of helped me paint my spider web of all the things I wanted to research was a paper, I think it's titled Qualitative Investigation into the Psychological Determinants of Success, blah, 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 something really long and academic. But for the non-academic listeners, I just went and sat with some of the best players in the world in their esports at the time and asked them, what do you think makes you so successful from a psychological perspective? Like, I asked it in a more layman's term, but I just wanted to hear their opinion. And they all said the same thing. Well, I can deal with stress better than other people somehow. I seem to be mentally tough and resilient to losses. And this whole spider's web of thing that the best players in the world thought made them successful became my whiteboard of things. Well, I need to investigate this further. And that paper's pretty publicly available. And if not, just send me an email and I send it to everyone who asks. But we've got a really nice graphic of every important thing the players said in that paper. And you'll see that they're just the things on my list that I'm researching. All of my papers since have just followed ticking those boxes. I'm not clever. I'm not inventive. I asked them what they thought was the best, and now that's my career. But to answer your question, Matt, Kabir, I forget who asked it. Mental toughness was one of those things that came up. These players felt unshakably confident. They felt that no matter where the game situation was, they had this innate ability to win from any scenario. And when we talk about mental toughness, having this unshakable confidence is a real core component to that, despite whichever definition you choose to explore it through, Matt. As you touched on, everyone has a different view on what mental toughness is. But confidence in your own abilities and in your interpersonal skills seems to be at the core of that. And all of these players I interviewed at baseline were like, I can do anything. And it wasn't arrogance. It was, I have years of demonstrated times where I've demonstrated to myself through trials, training, tribulations, losses. I've demonstrated to myself that I can come back from anywhere. And now I truly believe that. And I'm not just saying that to get in the opponent's head. I have a resume of it. And that's where my confidence comes from. And it was those set of interviews that really locked in my head. Well, there's something here. And in traditional sports, we call that mental toughness. And so that's where I'll start.
I think that's really, really fascinating work. There's in esports, we have the two big terms, I guess. You got flow state, you got tilt state. Mental toughness obviously helps athletes find themselves in either one of those. Do you kind of see those two states as black and white, or is there a bigger gray area that people kind of miss when talking about these terms?
Could you just reiterate the two terms for me? And then I want to ask you a quick question just before I start rambling.
So it's flow state and tilt state.
Okay, and just for our audience, what do you think that means? And this isn't me I just want to make sure we're being clear here, but what does flow mean and what does tilt mean?
Wait, the podcast host.
Oh, no.
I'm sorry, I can give you my definition if that's going to be easier.
It's good. No, this is great. Kabir, after you. Feel free to volunteer.
For me, I guess through personal experience, I feel like flow is that point where I feel autonomous. I feel every decision I'm making is smooth. Everything is going smoothly. You know, I can't do wrong because everything I've done previously has gone right for me. So every decision moving forward will also go right. And tilt is kind of things have gone so badly that even if I make the right play, the outcome is going to be negative. So I'm going to be risk averse or things like that. Like I'm in a position where I'm not making optimal decisions because of previous outcome failures.
Awesome. And then tilt?
So tilt is that where I'm being risk averse. Tilt is risk averse, whereas because I'm not performing, I'm not in that comfortable situation. I may be in unfamiliar territory, and I'm here like, I don't really know what to do. I'm scared if I do anything, it's only going to make things worse. So I'm just going to be avoidant. Whereas, that flow state is, I've been in this situation. I know exactly what to do. I can be really risky. I'm going to play with confidence. I'm going to play with my chest out. And even if things go wrong, it will never really blow up in my face.
That's awesome. And the reason I wanted to have you articulate that to me, and now I'll kind of articulate where I think they sit, is that in flow, there's a ton of traditional sport research on it, and it's starting to be changed now on how we conceptualize flow, and Christian Swan is really leading that, and I can talk a bit about that in a second. And it's something that came up in that initial study I talked about. All 7 players said, I just get in a flow state. But tilt's the Wild West. Everyone has a different definition of tilt. And then there are emerging perspectives on what leads to tilt before we even get to, well, what is it? And so just keep that in mind, that if you're a young academic and you're watching this going, oh, what impact can I make on the esports industry? Help us understand what tilt is in esports, because like you said, Kabir, it's really common. You ask a player, oh, what happened on stage? I got tilted. We don't actually 100% know what that means. And because we don't know what that means, every player's definition of it might be different. If you're listening right now, you probably had a different or slightly different definition to the one Kabir just said for both of those terms, and you'll disagree with the two terms, how I define them in a second. So there's a huge avenue there. One, to investigate what does flow look like in esport, because all the elite players say they get into a flow state, and the research in traditional sport is suggesting it's a little more complicated than just the traditional flow state. And then there's also this beckoning opportunity that is, every pro player ever will say they've felt tilted at a time. What does that mean? Is that something that's specific to esports and not like we've seen in poker before and other traditional sporting fields? Or is it just the esports version of things? we've seen in the past? And then what models of sports psychology can we use to understand that? And I will talk a bit about stress and coping when I try to answer that question. So there's a huge amount of opportunities there. And if you're a coach listening to this, if you can figure out a program, a system, a way to talk to players about tilt that helps them better control tilt, helps them realize, hey, I'm starting to tilt and this is what I can do to stop it, or I've just tilted and here's how I can get back to baseline. If you can develop something like that, the impact that you'll make on the esports industry is incredible. So 2 beckoning avenues for research and practice that really need to be explored. To answer your question, Kabir, the athletes that I've interviewed, esport athletes that I've interviewed, they report flow to be this state where they're not thinking about the buttons that they're clicking with their left hand on the keyboard or how they're moving their mouse. They're not thinking about the decisions that they're making or the meta game that's happening or where they should be. If we're talking about CSGO, they're not thinking about when they should throw their utility. They're just doing. And because they've got years, in some cases decades of refined hard work on these skills and these motor actions, it's just happening. They don't feel like they can make a mistake. They're not aware of the clock. They're not aware of time. They're just absolutely present in the zone, in the moment, and everything is going right. And that's the traditional version of flow in traditional sports. New research is differentiating between 2 different types of flow, or 2 different states. Flow state, which is more like that traditional version. You know, you're exploring, you're not thinking, you're having fun, you're almost playful in how you approach your task. And then there are these clutch states, and that's not to be confused with the term clutch in esports. There is this clutch state in flow research that's when you're working hard, but you make the conscious decision to work even harder. So let's use a running example. You're sprinting and you've done a 10K race, and for the first 9.5 Ks, you haven't even felt that your legs are sore. You're just so in the zone. You're out in front. You're winning. This is amazing. I love running. This is why I do it. Here comes my gold medal. And then in the last 500 meters, the second person comes up beside you, and you suddenly have to bite down, dig deep, get gritty. I'm trying to use all the words to help evoke an experience that people have had in their own life, and you have to work hard. And those 2 states have been conflated in traditional sports, and they're starting to kind of try to pull them apart as being 2 different states. So if you're a young researcher looking at flow, and you want to look at flow in esports, or you're a coach and you really want to understand what's the cutting edge literature on flow in esports, you could start to understand. And if you Google Christian Swan flow states, or I can provide Matt and Kabir some links for you to get started, it's something that esports pros, the very best esports pros, think is making a huge difference to their performance. And if you can understand that cutting edge research that's coming out of traditional sport and help your players get into those states, know which 2 states they're in and how to optimize those states for them, you could make such an incredible difference. One thing I find really, really interesting is that in traditional sports, the clutch state, that kind of gritty, for a fighter, it's like bite down on my mouthpiece and go hard kind of thing. That doesn't actually sound that different to me to the clutch state that we refer to in esports, where it's a 1v3 or a 1v4 to win the round of Counter-Strike, where you're not in flow state, maybe. You're in that, I have to do this. I have to defuse this bomb. I have to get these final 3 kills. I think there might actually be some really interesting similarities there between the traditional sports research and the colloquial terms that we use to describe certain performances in esports. So before I jump into tilt, did that evoke anything for either of you, or any questions you think your audience might be asking me right now?
Well, Dylan, we've spoken a lot about tilt, and I hope that message that it question everything, be critical, like make sure if you're a researcher, don't assume that it's always the same in sport and esport. If you're a practitioner, like a coach, for example, try and work out what these terms mean for your players. Like do your own little in-house research. And it was interesting in Kabir. I think your definition was very well articulated, but you didn't even mention the word frustration. And I think if there is no common definition of tilt, but I think a lot of players would ascribe it to some sense of frustration. And that, you described something more than that. You almost described a behavior, like you're in a state where you avoid certain things. And that's not common with other like emotional reaction type things. So I think Dylan, you and I have gone back and forth on this a lot, and I think it's there's a wealth of research to be done there. The clutch state things like this is, flow is something I find super interesting. I mean, back when I was teaching or lecturing in sports, like flow was something that I think everyone understood what it felt like, and then you look into the research on it, and there are some caveats like flow is when you're sort of performing in a sense in an optimal place, and in that place you tend to get better, and then flow is therefore like your level of challenge to be in that optimal state has to be a bit higher next time because you're that little bit better. And over, it's like it's a moving thing. It's not just like one zone that you get into and that's like tick the box. Like it's gonna, as you progress through your career, the challenge has to be a little bit higher to evoke those states, was my understanding of it. And I always found that concept fascinating. So again, something I'd love to see more work on in esports. I mean, you mentioned Christian Swan. I gave a lecture last week on goal setting and the overuse of smart goals, and like that work.
That's him too, yeah.
Phenomenal. So like, I mean, he's involved in your program at Southern Cross, I think. Right?
He's a very big part of our psychology teaching unit and a research leader at Southern Cross, which is why I'm so all over his research. And as you just said, Matt, he's now looking into goal setting, and you can see how if you're someone who his career started with a fascination around flow states and optimal performance, if something, and people will see this when they read his research, but if you see that the goals you set, and as a coach, the goals you set can impact the states that you get into, so something like flow, you can see how Christian's gone, okay, well maybe I need to start back here, and I need to understand the goals that we're setting before I can think about how to help people get to their optimal state, because optimal state is a subjective definition by the performer. And so for those who start reading Christian's work, you'll see that it's kind of like, here are some of the best ways we can help people get into flow and optimize their clutch states. And that can be the goals you set. And so that's where his research is now starting to focus on, is how do I set the general population or elite performers set better goals to get them in better states to achieve better outcomes. It's a really brilliant progression.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. And I highly recommend that paper, the overuse of smart goals, and I think 151 different terms to define the acronym SMART, like absolutely bananas. But okay, so I mean, moving forward slightly, you're going through your list of qualities that players see as vital before performance. Stress and coping are on there somewhere. Whenever I think about these words, I think about you and your work and the sort of depth of knowledge and thought that you've got and put into these terms. Could we get into that? What are they? Why are they important? What is unknown about them within esports?
Yeah, so I'll get into stress and coping now, and Kabir, I'll circle back to Tilt before I finish the stress and coping conversation that we have, because I actually think that Tilt sits within people's ability or lack of ability to cope with stress. Mm-hmm. And so I haven't forgotten your question. We'll just come around to it when we talk about coping or ineffective coping and what that might lead to. Stress is really interesting. And one of the unexpected findings from that earlier interview study that I talked about was that a lot of these players talked about things that got in their way. They talked about stresses that interrupted their high performance. So we started with kind of what's your mindset like when you're winning, when you won that, I can't give away who the players are, but when you won that really important esport competition and you were holding X trophy above your head, what was the state you were in 20 minutes before when that wasn't your trophy? And they talked about that really, really articulately. And then they also had a really clear understanding of the things that got in the way of that, the things that caused them stress or the pressure or anything that seems to be kind of this impeding them to getting into high performance. And so stress is kind of that. It's a subjective thing, and this is one of the first things that I talk about when I talk to players about stress, and is that we all feel stress. We all have a label for stress. We know when we're feeling stressed and when we're not feeling stressed. But what most people don't understand is kind of that's different for everyone. And it's all subjective. It's all psychological. And I'll give the really abridged version of it here for coaches who might want to be using this with their players or helping this to understand their players' experience, is that stress, put really simply, is us looking out at the thing that might be causing us stress. So a teammate we don't get on with, a big competition that we've got coming up, or a game we've just had where we were the source of our team struggle, i.e. my performance sucked. That might be the thing we're looking out at, and we're evaluating that. And then what we're doing is we're looking inwards at the same time, and we're going, how many personal resources do I perceive that I have to overcome that? And now I'm going to do some shocking maths with everyone here, but let's say you're an 8 out of 10 looking at your terrible performance, but you go, I've actually got 8 out of 10 personal resources to overcome that, i.e. I've got 3 weeks to train for the next game. Those mistakes I don't normally make. When we look inwards, we're going, I got tons of personal resources to overcome that. When those two numbers, the object and the internal, are at the same level, we feel stressed, but not super stressed. When the things from the object or the number from the object is really high, like it's not something I can see myself overcoming, and our number is really low, that gap between those two numbers, that is psychological stress. That's when we have this, oh crap, I can't deal with this. I don't know how to bridge that gap. Now, some of the coaches listening right now will be going, well, you said the internal evaluation has something to do with confidence or personal resources. And this is exactly where you can start working with your players, in that they might not be accurately perceiving their internal resources. And so as a coach, you go, well, no, actually, we've got 3 weeks before the next game. I'm going to help you with your aim training or with your character specific skills or communication. And you help the player realize that they're actually here, or even they've actually got plenty of personal resources to overcome this obstacle. And you can start down regulating that stress. And in all the slideshows and talks that I give about this, I use scales and talk about how can I help coaches help their players' scales balance properly to remove stress, or at least minimize stress, such that it's not impeding performance. And so when we talk about psychological stress, not necessarily objective stress or like cortisol levels and heart rate variability and all those more objective measures, when we talk about psychological stress, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about how we appraise the thing, how we look at the thing outside of us, and how we balance that against an inwards glance at the resources we think we have to overcome whatever that object is. Now, this is when I think tilt might come into it. This is for anyone listening, this is when we move away from science and we move into kind of my opinion, because this hasn't been done yet. When we have this gap between the thing that's causing us stress and the resources that we think we have to deal with that source of stress, we have to cope with that. We have to use a series of coping strategies that we can either learn through a coach, a mentor, or a performance coach, or that we've just learnt through trial and error in our growing up in our childhood, to overcome this gap or this negative feeling, this feeling of, oh crap, how am I going to deal with this? And there are 3 main ways that we do that. There are mastery coping skills, emotion regulation coping skills, and then kind of avoidance or goal withdrawal coping skills. Now, with the mastery coping skills, that's when we get in and we try to change the thing that's causing us stress. I'm not playing well, I'll train harder. I'll go and I messed up the plays, I'll read the playbook more. You know, if we think about rugby, soccer, cricket, it's I wasn't fit enough, I'm going to train harder before the next game or in the next preseason. And that happens in esports all the time. So those mastery coping skills, and when we go in and we try to change the situation or the thing through better preparation or removing the source of stress, we go in and we try to change the thing that's causing us stress. The emotion regulation skills are how we deal with all those ugly thoughts that come up. All those, you're not good enough. I'm really angry at that teammate. They let me down here, or all those things that come up. They're all emotion regulation skills. And a lot of the things we talk about with players are things like helping them better accept the things they can't control. Focus on control the controllables, focus on controlling the controllables. A lot of breathing exercises. So if you're in a specific competition, You can't sit back and get into a more meditative state when you're meant to be clutching the round and being like, how did I get here? These are negative thoughts that are arising. How am I going to deal with these? You have to be able to put that all out of your head and focus on the task at hand. So we can use breathing techniques or really ingrained, focused thought patterns to overcome some of that. And that's where I think tilt sits. So I think tilt, or emotional dysregulation, as in something happened and now I can't think straight. My emotions are running too high. I'm going to be toxic to my teammates or to my opponent, or I'm going to play purposefully worse than I know I could. I think that kind of tilting, that emotional dysregulation, is a lack of emotion regulation skills. And for players who are looking to get better with tilt, or for coaches who are looking to help players who tilt, I think we need to help that person better deal with negative emotions. Because very rarely is tilt just a, now I'm fully upset, inconsolable, yelling into the mic, flooding the comms. It's a progression. It's, we lost that round and that was someone else's fault, but people are blaming me. Or, we're 5 rounds behind and I really want to win this, but it's everyone else's fault. And I'm just getting... Coaches can work with players and help them better cope with those negative series of emotions. And that's my understanding of tilt. Now, there could be research that comes out in the next 5 years that go, that's absolutely not what tilt is. But through a stress and coping framework, we can understand that something's happening. We don't perceive we have the resources, or it's very equal, the resources that we have to overcome it. And we don't have control over it. So we can't go and use a mastery coping strategy and change it. So like teammate is a really often one that comes up here, because we can't just get a new teammate mid-game. How am I going to deal with all the negative stuff that's coming up? And for young people who play esports, who haven't necessarily developed all those skills, I think this is where tilt tends to exist. And I think this is where that term tilt comes from esports, is a lack of emotion coping skills. And just before we go back into tilt, the last set of coping skills are those kind of avoidance or goal withdrawal coping skills. And my research is really starting to focus on burnout, and I can talk more about that if we're interested in talking about that. But when esport players avoid coping with their stresses, so they drink, or they stop thinking about it, or they stop talking about it, they do something to get away from it, this is when we start to see some negative mental health outcomes. This is when we start to see, obviously, decreased performance, but more worrying is this increased levels of burnout, and then burnout can be related to subsequent worse mental health diagnoses. So you've got your 3 options of coping. And if you're a player listening to this, one thing you can start doing without talking to someone like myself or anyone in a coaching scenario is just start labeling how am I coping with things? That annoyed me. Did I change it? Did I better deal with what came up within me? Or did I just bury my head in the sand? And knowing that burying your head in the sand is not a good long-term strategy, hopefully gives you the motivation to get better at the first 2 and really take an active approach, whether it's actively dealing with yourself or actively dealing with the thing causing you stress, to overcome it or to better manage your response to it. I know I've gone a bit off reservation there, but I hope I've helped. That's kind of my last 4 years abridged of stress and coping in esports. And I can talk really specifically about the differences between traditional sport and esports, or wherever you guys might want to take it, but I'll let you guide us wherever we go next.
Yes, something.
Yeah,
sorry,
go ahead. No, go ahead, Kabir.
So something really fascinating that came up is you kept mentioning back teammates. A paper I find myself reading almost every month now by yourself is The Perceived Stressors, where you went and talked to a bunch of players from the different esports and tried to break down what came out and what stressed them out. And I'm a League of Legends player, so that's the esport I'm most interested in. And it's what was remarkable was 53% of the responses were around that teammate behavior, right? Either it's communication, their play, or a teammate getting tilted, a teammate ruining that practice quality. Now, for those who are frequent esport enjoyers, we know that you become good at the game by playing solo queue, right? And what's the number one rule to solo queue for a lot of people? It's mute all, right? You don't care what your teammates have to say, you just focus on yourself. Do you feel that sort of environment right now, in terms of to reach this level of expertise, you play in an environment which is so individualistic, and then now you're competing in teams? Do you think that disconnect is something that's promoting this development of tilt behaviors? And if so, is there a world where esport organizations should look to create academies where you get people in like platinum, low diamond, and then build them those mechanical skills, but teach them how to be teammates?
That's such an interesting question, and I'll answer the first part of it, and then I'll jump into the second part of it, because that's obviously my goal for the development of esports, is what you just said about designing academies to train these skills in young people. But a really interesting finding from that paper was that as you move up your in-game rank, your stresses change. So the majority of the people in the paper who we surveyed everyone was in the top 40%. So they were in the 60th percentile or above for their various esport. So we're talking about kind of casual competitive players right through to competitive and then elite competitive players. As their ranks went up, the thing that was causing them the most stress changed. And what I mean by that is the lower the rank, the more likely they were to be annoyed by their teammates, or the stress in their esport environment was the people they were playing with. And that is a big part due to solo queue, and that you can't always pick your teammates. And that unfortunately, the thing that helps you get picked if we're talking about league, is being challenger or being at a really high rank in your esport is kind of the first thing that can help you get noticed. And to do that, you have to play thousands of games with people you didn't choose to play with. And at those lower ranks, that was the thing that was causing them stress. At the higher ranks, the thing that was causing them stress was their own performance. So they'd managed to somehow move past worrying about teammates, things they couldn't control, and the thing that they were focusing on and therefore that was causing them the most stress was, how well am I playing? Because that's what I can control in this scenario. And jumping back to the coping research, one of the really interesting findings that we've found, if you remember, I talked about mastery, emotion regulation, and goal withdrawal. In traditional sport, the coping strategy that is the biggest predictor of performance in their sport is just mastery. All of my research in esports suggests that mastery and emotion regulation are equally as important and equally more effective than goal withdrawal or avoidance. So that, to me, and there's still early findings, as in we need to keep replicating these in different populations, but that to me says something about the nature of esports builds people who are better at emotion-focused coping at the professional level, and as well as what we need to do in traditional sports, which is mastery cope as well. So just so that I've explained that really clearly, if this was a traditional sport podcast, I'd be saying the research suggests that you need to get better at mastery coping strategies. Figure out what the source of stress is, figure out how to change it. Because I research esports and we're talking to esports players and consumers here, you need to deal with your emotions just as much as you need to change the thing that's causing you stress. And I think when we start to see that the top players are more worried about their performance, and they report that their most effective coping strategies are equally mastery and emotion-focused strategies, that's saying something. And so if you're a Team Liquid or a FaZe or an institutional esports team listening to this, if you can take players that are at that 60th percentile, maybe a bit higher, 80th, 90th percentile from the in-game rank perspective, and you can help them better cope with emotions, who knows what unpolished diamonds are sitting out there in solo queue that could be the next faker that just can't deal with emotions, or that just tilts too easily. And all we might need to do is get them from a younger age, or when they're pardon me, still developing, and train them in some of these psychological skills. Who knows, that could be the only thing holding them back. And so those couple of bits of research combined suggest that maybe this is something we should be focusing on if we want to build these talent development pathways in esports and these big academies like we see in traditional sport. Maybe as much as training their muscles or their reaction time or their aim training or their champion specific skills, maybe in esports we need to be spending more time or an equal amount of time training them to be better copers with stress, more mentally tough. Who knows? That's what I think my research is suggesting, and I hope I've answered your question in a roundabout way there.
Is part of me feels like I remember the paper that Phil Birch and I wrote interviewing professional League of Legends players, and the step into the structured professional team environment was a big one. and that was sort of something that prompted a complete shift in the quality of motivation that the players had. It suddenly became a job a bit less intrinsically rewarding just to play. Is there a similar sort of journey there in terms of if you play a lot of solo queue by yourself, you're able to mute those people that you don't get along with, or maybe dodge them or avoid the people that don't bring stress into your gaming. And then if you enter into a team environment, suddenly there are stresses you can't escape. Is that where emotional regulation is like, it's almost like you haven't had to deal with that, so you haven't developed those strategies, and then suddenly you're in an environment where you can't escape them, and so you have to deal with them? Or am I reading the sort of the dynamic wrong there?
It's actually a really tricky thing, and this is the problem when you're kind of the first to start making findings, is that
right.
It's not causal, but at a meta point, one of the main things that I want to say around this is that if you're a young cricketer in Australia, and I'm sure this is reflective in other traditional sport pathways in the world, I've been playing with the team, with a coach, since I was 5, in most cases. I've learned how to lose in front of mum and dad. I've learned how to lose in front of strangers. I've learned how to have difficult conversations from a really young age, not being able to mute all with my coach, with the opponents, with my teammates. I've made terrible blunders. I've emotionally dysregulated. I've behaved in a way that's shameful, and learnt how I can rebuild myself after that. I've had all those experiences in a facilitated, safe way in traditional sports. And exactly what you described, Matt, is what happens in esports. Someone might have just mute-alled and just been a really good top laner, or a really good CSGO player, the best AWPer that there is, and I hit my shots, I win my lane, and because I win my lane so hard, I win more of the games than I lose, and the way ELO works, now I'm challenger, now I'm a pro player. And they haven't had that exposure at a much, kind of progressive overload of stress or pressure. They haven't had that exposure for 10 years in a traditional sport pathway. It's nothing, and then it's, if we're talking about some of the bigger League of Legends scenes, it's 200,000 people watching you now, and in Twitch chat who might be saying horrible things to you that you've never been exposed to, and on Twitter and all of the Twitter esports storm that can be. And that can be, I could be exaggerating here, but that can be 2 weeks ago, I didn't exist. Now I'm, getting on stage, ready to play for an LEC team, and I made a mistake because I've never been under this level of pressure, and 200,000 people have told me I suck. That's a big jump. That's not a structured progression. That is a huge jump. And I think we as an esport research community, us as coaches, us as players, need to understand that there is a big change in the scenario and the context of our performance when we're making these jumps. And we do need to understand, well, maybe in traditional sports, coping with emotions isn't something that pops up as much, because we've learned to do it for 2 decades before we get our chance as a pro. And maybe because esports is such a new industry that they go, I can't deal with this. I don't know how to say respectfully to someone that their play is causing me to play worse, or that I disagree with them. I don't know how to do any of that, and I'm imploding. Maybe that's what my results are reflecting. Or maybe it is because we're often playing online, and the players who understand that this is a team game in solo queue, or even in kind of academy teams, and the players who can best work with the teammates that they have and not mute all, maybe they're the ones that are filtering up through to the top, such that they are really focusing on their performance because they're such great communicators. We don't know, and that's one of the things that keeps me up at night, and that hopefully when we have this podcast in 2 years, I can say, actually, Matt, this is what it was. But at the moment, we just don't know.
Goodness me. Just thinking about that player you described going from, last week nobody knows me, this week 250,000 people are criticizing me for a mistake, and then the subsequent action of perhaps in a review after that game, the coach coming in and saying, all right, we're going to focus on draft. I think we made a few mistakes there. Like, just the incoherence there, like that you can see how ludicrous that would be as a response. And that's probably like the default nowadays, I suppose, in League of Legends. It's like, I heard recently somebody said like draft accounts for me like 80% of the performance, and then that was sort of debunked it in a sense, because this player, like the stresses on this player, what they have to deal with, what they have to cope with is far more than that. And I think practitioners, coaches, we all have a role in as you say, using some of those techniques those strategies you already described to help players improve in those areas. Yeah, wow.
Can you imagine if you're that player and then your coach goes, well, you're the top laner, and I'm obviously going to draft for bot side, so you're going to be in a losing lane because, why would we risk our game on you scaling when we don't know you versus, so you just say, like, I'm damned if I do and I'm damned if I don't, it's so hard. And it's really something that I'm sure coaches are aware of, but I think there is this really strategic opportunity for a big esports org to recognize this and go, it might not win us worlds this year, it might not win us worlds for 3 years, but if we have a tiered academy system where we're focusing on in-game training with already really talented people and psychological skills training from a young or developmental stage, and we're going to help them like you would if it was a traditional sport team. We're going to help them through high school or university or whatever, and let them just focus on their game and build all these skills in them. I think those orgs that do that, and the earlier they do that, are going to be the ones that start more often and more consistently winning these major tournaments. And it's not going to be, and I know people listening will be like, oh, but there are teams that win tournaments, consistently. And you're right. But I think it's going to be these teams that in the long run have the most success. When someone falls out, they can put in another great player. It's not that we got 5 great players for one split and that's what projected us into the big leagues. It's that we've got 40 great players and they're constantly battling with each other, iron sharpening iron, and that our 5 best players this split, or this game even, are just representative of 40 incredible players that we have who are all helping each other get better and have been doing so for 5 to 10 years. When esports gets to that stage, and starts to mirror traditional sports a lot more, it'll be really interesting to understand how stress and coping changes with the structure of our players. And we don't have that player that I just described who was a nobody 2 weeks ago and is now walking out or sitting on stage in front of an unprecedented amount of people for that person.
Thoroughly underprepared in that moment. Yeah, amazing. Sorry, Kabir, go for it.
That sounds awfully similar to what Fnatic is going through at the moment with their League of Legends roster. So last split was their first time with the new changes to how the structure is of LEC. They never made playoffs, right? And now they've come out, they've brought 2 people from their academy team, their top laner and support, and they kind of fit under that philosophy of, we'll play for that bot side. We know we have Reckless, one of the most prized ADCs of Europe. We're going to play for him.
Big name.
Right. Yeah. And it's like, it makes sense to play for him, right? Because we know what he can do. And now he's the top laner. He's been focused the past 3 games, right? He's not had a great weekend. And the Fnatic fan base is notorious, right? They're like the Millwall fan base of esports, and they'll come at your throats if you don't perform for the team. And
also reference, by the way, I think most people this, for an international podcast, like Millwall, I suppose, lower league English football club with fans that are passionate,
very passionate,
to the point of being pretty intense,
unproductive.
Yeah,
right.
But they are. Do you feel like bringing certain players into these kind of environments adds to that stress, where there's so much social media pressure? Because it feels like esports is one of these industries where one of the roster spots is dictated by social media. It's not 5 people decided by management, but one of these roster changes is always due to like PR or to pacify the fan base.
I don't think that would be, and again, I'm not a traditional sports expert, but I'm sure I've seen the media influence selections in major traditional sporting teams, and that it wasn't just the selectors who picked a team because they wanted to keep the nation on side. I know we've seen that with Australian cricket teams in the past, so I'm not sure that's an esport specific issue. One thing you did say that throws back to that paper that I initially conducted interviewing the most elite players I could get my hands on, and it's something that I think research is starting to touch on, is you've got a player like Reckless who is, you know, they're one of the biggest names in esports, one of the people you think about when you think of long-term league lineage. How do you help that player have faith in the top laner that they didn't know about 3 weeks ago, or and vice versa? How do you help the new top laner or the new support? Sorry, even worse in a bot support matchup. How do you help them build team cohesion? And that was actually something that came up in that earlier paper I keep mentioning. Is one of the things that elite esport coaches are doing, and the players are reporting this to me as something their coaches are spending a lot of time doing, is doing things that help the team build cohesion, connections, bond, community, whatever word that you want to use to define a connection between 5 to 10, 15 players if you've got an academy team as well. Knowing that that's going to help buffer against some of the stresses that they're going to face on a competitive roster, knowing that your teammates are going to make mistakes, and being friends with that person and liking and respecting and caring about that person might be the reason you don't go, you really suck and here's all the negative things I think about you, versus putting your arm around them and going, we'll get them next time and let me know if I can help. You know, that these coaches and the players understand that building team cohesion is so important. And so I wonder how, if for the coaches listening, or for, you know, people who have worked with players before, I wonder what some of the most effective ways, given the short turnaround contract ugliness of esport competition, what are some of the most effective ways to quickly and authentically build team cohesion amongst 5 players who 2 weeks ago might not have known each other, and in 4 weeks' time are going to that stage and potentially going to be that person, that hypothetical person that we've just talked about, or in your analogy, Kabir, being this support player that's now playing next to a legend of the game with all these fans who are, if you win, we will idolize you. If you lose, we will bury you. So it's like the stakes. How do we help players and a team as a unit buffer against that coming pressure? I think the coaches that can best do that are going to be the ones that have success on the international stages.
I think we solved that though. It's the team dinner with the social media photo. I think that's
Oh, well, we can, yeah, it's done then. Publish that.
Team cohesion tick.
Yeah. Forget culture. Forget how we're going to approach each other with specific conversations. Forget communication styles. Let's just team dinner with a photo. Love it.
forget shared leadership. Just do that team dinner and plug it in and you're good to go. Excellent. I mean, I would love to go into the mental health burnout. Just before we do so, something that struck me that I loved about what you said was these sort of scales. Like, you know, I almost thought of the expression "tilting the scales." Like, what do you have?
Writing my programs for me.
There we go. Next paper title, go for it. Like you see this in front of you. You see these, like, I mean, you're 8 out of 10. What's in front of you, like external to you that is challenging. And then 8 out of 10, that sort of like that rating of what you have, what you possess to deal with it. Like that's a phenomenal way of thinking, I think. And I know it's obviously based on a lot of evidence, but definitely something I'm going to carry with me. That's really well explained. So thank you for that.
And sorry to cut you off, Matt.
Yeah.
I've literally just scratched the surface. That process, the scales that we just talked about for people who want to go and research that more, that's called stress appraisal. As in, how do we appraise the thing that might potentially cause us stress? And there's so many subcomponents, as I kind of touched on with making the appraisal of the thing external to us. There's kind of 4 key elements to that. And with making the appraisal internally, that everything Kabir talked about with that mental toughness, resilience, all of the things that help you understand, or the filters that you put on your understanding of yourself, your confidence, your communication, all of these kind of things contribute to one of those 2 parts. And it's an endless field of learning. And if you're interested in it, all of my papers where I talk about stress and coping, I break that model down at the start. There's some images there. And if you're a coach who goes, that's what I need to help my players do better, there's a whole bunch of resources that I've got out online that can support you to do that better. So sorry to interrupt, but stress appraisal is that scale in academic terms.
Fantastic. Yeah, brilliant. And I will definitely link to all of that when we release this episode. So mental health and burnouts, could we start with what is mental health?
That is a really, really tricky question. And so I'm in a tricky spot as a researcher. So I don't work in the mental health space, but I understand that for performers to perform at their best, they need to be mentally healthy. Before we can talk about getting those extra 1 or 2%, we need to have happy, healthy people. And I mean that both physically and psychologically. So I'm going to steer away from the things I don't know, which is that more traditional kind of what is mental health and how do we measure it, and anxiety and depression and diagnosis. That is not my field. Whenever one of my players presents with anything that I think is bordering on that, we go straight to the experts. That's not for me. What I'm really interested in understanding is, in the traditional sport context, the things we know that precede or predict those negative mental health outcomes that are outside of my world. How can I understand those? How can I use a stress and coping framework or a mental toughness or resilience framework to understand which of my players are at risk of this? And one of the best things I've landed on is athlete burnout. And so this research is still happening. I'm still learning in this space, but what we're finding is that the way you choose to cope with stress, and it is a choice, we have to maintain that we believe it's a choice, because otherwise we have no control over it, whether it's the choice to change the thing or the choice to change how we reacted. We have to maintain that we have control over some part of the process, or we're helpless. What if those coping elements can lead to something that can then predict your negative mental health, and burnout seems to be this thing for me. Burnout seems to be where I've landed on that, and the reason I got there was from player reports. Players are saying that the thing that ruins their careers is burnout. I no longer get a sense of joy from winning or doing well or being good at it. It's gone. I no longer get excited about doing this thing. I don't want to be here anymore. Training doesn't excite me like it used to. Winning doesn't excite me like it used to. I'm just bleh towards the whole thing. I'm burnt out. And again, that's not the most academic definition of it. But people like stress. They seem to know when they're feeling burnt out, run down, run out of energy. And if I can help people cope better, and I can help them not burn out, then that's where I'm going to use my knowledge of stress and coping. And the paper that we're working on, we're still running some of the stats. So I'm going to be really cautious with my language around what it does and doesn't impact. But the initial statistics are suggesting that if you avoid stresses, and I mean, this feels intuitive and kind of common sense for everyone. If you don't deal with the things in your life as an esport player that are causing you stress, that are keeping you up at night, if you don't cope with them, you're going to start you're more likely to feel burnt out. And if you feel burnt out for a long period of time, we could be opening the door to some of these much more serious negative mental health issues. So I'll be sure to make you guys all aware of some of those findings, because it's with that 60th percentile and above, so that top 40% cohort again. And we've got 500 survey respondents in that bracket. So it's a decent chunk of data. And yeah, we are still working our way through that, but that's probably the main thing I can say to coaches and players listening here is find a way to cope, actively do something about your stress, because not coping is a version of coping and it's very suboptimal.
Right. Yeah, fantastic. So I like there is a point at which our competencies as researchers are no longer, and coaches and practitioners, let's say coaches and researchers, for example, there is a point at which our competencies no longer are appropriate when we're dealing with players that are suffering from mental ill health. And I know there's been research out there to help to know what that is and what it looks like. And that's when
you wrote about this.
Well, I wrote about where the performance coach and sports psychologist, how they work together, and at what point the sports psychologist, at least in the UK and Australia and the USA and other countries where it's like a protected title. I know that the training route, a huge part of that training route and professional accreditation is knowing where your competencies start and end, and at what point someone might need to be referred on to, for example, clinical help. And I'm not sure if those terms are the same in Australia, but certainly in the UK, it's sport and exercise psychologist in the field, performance coach maybe shares some of those tasks. You can work on a sort of the team dynamics. You can sort of offer feedback to the coach around communication and things like that. Maybe it's a gray area about the one-to-one work with players, but certainly like engaging in a whole needs analysis about what they're feeling and why that might be is certainly the work of the sport and exercise psychologist. And then within those contexts, anything that comes up as like a potentially impairing that individual's quality of life, and it's just from like the mental factors around mental ill health, that requires a sport and exercise psychologist to identify and then know where to go with that information, what we might call a referral chain. I understand as well mental health is sort of this spectrum, and you need that foundation of a good quality mental health to work on those performance enhancing sort of techniques, that side of the spectrum. But I really like that idea of burnout being some signs that we can all identify to start thinking about this process, like where are my athletes, where are my players on this spectrum, and then knowing where can we take them for additional help if necessary. And
I'd really like to touch on something you said, and I think you undersold the importance of it. And for any coach listening, I'd really encourage them to reflect on what you just said around coaches and knowing your boundaries. And this not knowing something as a coach doesn't limit you. Your primary function as a coach, as far as I can see, is to help get the best out of your players. And if you think that for every scenario you are the answer and that you have the answer for that, I think you're playing a really risky game in terms of the percentages. And I say this with confidence because we just need to look at traditional sports. You have a head coach, but then you have a sub coach for almost every other discipline of support that player needs. And then they have teams if it's a really big institution. And I think one of the things we struggle with as esport coaches, esports support staff, is that for so long we've had to go at it alone. For so long, the teams we've worked with have had no funding, and it's still the case for a lot of teams. But we've got this really kind of mindset of there's no one else out there who will support me. I have to figure this all out on my own. I don't think as we move forwards, coaches who have this mindset of, oh, I'm the one-stop shop, I should have every answer, I should know everything. I don't think that's the best way. I don't think that's where what the best coaches will be doing and I don't think that's what they're doing now, but I think in 5 years, I think that'll be crazy to even suggest that you know everything. But I know that 5 years ago, that was it. It was your 4 teammates, if you're a 5-man team, and your coach against the world. And that doesn't have to be that way anymore. And it's not the case. If you're a coach listening to this, what's going to make you the best coach in the eyes of your players is knowing when to get the best sleep scientist in, the best sports psychologist in, the best strength and conditioning coach, or the fitness expert to come and help you. It's going to be building that high performance support team, acknowledging that it's not going to look like the Australian cricket team where they're paid full-time 24/7 drop of the hat to be there for the players. It could be we've had 3 losses in a row in the split, the players are down in the dumps, and we need someone to come in and specifically talk about X, or none of them can sleep and we need them to come in and help with that, or they're all really unfit and can't get through to the 5th game every time we have a best of 5, so we need a protocol for blah. The best coaches, as you've kind of said, Matt, are going to have this network and be able to draw on people, whether it, full-time capacity, part-time capacity, one-off capacity, to support their players when they need it. And this is a much better long-term strategy than thinking, I'll wing it and see, I'm the coach, I'll figure it out. You might be really good at what you're really good at, but knowing what you're not good at is also a strength of your coaching. And I really want to reiterate that because I've worked with some coaches that are like, no, I'll figure it out, I know. And it's like, okay, good luck to you. So yeah, great point.
Amen.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, an important one, right? And thoroughly agree. So the other thing you said, it's kind of intuitive that if you look at your week in a series of blocks, as a series of or constellation of blocks, and more of those blocks are, or less of those blocks are characterized by stress, you're probably going to be in a better spot to perform. And maybe there are some stresses that are, they don't need to occur in great volume to be detrimental. But as a general rule, I think more instances of well-being and good health and positivity are probably better for performance than the same amount of, I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm sort of lost the plot a little bit, but it's kind of like
I'd actually like to build on that.
right? Yeah.
Well, it's a fine line. So I start any talk that I give where I'm working with a specific set of players by saying that stress isn't this scary monster. Yes, it has all these negative side effects, but stress is what gets you up in the morning. Stress is what gives you the, the bit of adrenaline or the bit of focus that you need to play that extra game, to do that bit of extra research. Utilizing stress and harnessing stress is probably what's contributed to these players who I'm talking to already at the elite level. It's probably helped you get here. And so thinking of it as something that is inherently negative is dangerous. And I encourage people to think of stress as something that we can utilize to get the best out of us, but something that if left unchecked can bring the worst out of us. And so it's this, I don't want to say it's dangerous, but this is coming back to one of Kabir's early questions about why stress? Why did you start there? Because I think it has so much potential to create great performers and be the thing that pushes us to achieve the best. But it's also got such a downside. It's also got such a, well, I didn't cope with it, I didn't deal with it, and now look at me. My life and my professional career is in ruin. And so I think we do want to downregulate stress where we can, or cope with stress effectively whenever we can. But we want that stress to be there. We want that thing pushing us and driving us to be the best, that we can in those big competitions, in those big prize pools, and the big, the things that the reason we compete, that innate drive in humans to be competitive, and esports is our avenue for that, for hundreds of millions of young people. We want to keep that there, but we just don't want to let it destroy us.
Some pressure makes diamonds, right? Not too little, not too much.
Controlled pressure.
Controlled
with pressure.
Exactly. And not constant pressure. Otherwise, yeah. Okay, cool. Kabir, any reflections on this so far? I feel like we've sort of covered a lot today. And I feel like I'm personally, some of my thoughts have been completely clarified on these subjects. So any reflections from you, Kabir?
Yeah, I mean, I think my next question was honestly just going to bring up how stress is important for performance, and I wanted to get Dylan's thoughts on that. So I guess like you kind of, both of you guys read my mind. I got that question out before I could. No, I think it's really, really cool to read all the work that Dylan's done already. It's some of the work that I've based a lot of my future understanding of esports and where I want to see future esports go off of. But also the fact that Dylan has taken his research, used it within the top 60, or sorry, the top 40%, but he's also using it from his lived-in experiences as performance coach, sports psychologist. It's good to see that there's overlap, and something that's frequently been mentioned today is there's so much overlap between traditional sport and esports that there's more than just stress that we can look at here. We can look at so many other things and adopt things from traditional sport. I guess that's one of my biggest takeaways here, listening to Dylan, is these two worlds that look on paper so polar opposites, because one is sports and one is esports. At the end of the day, they are, in terms of the people participating in it, very similar. So there's so much more that we can uncover from here, which is something that's really encouraging for future academics like myself here.
Yeah,
it's a great starting point to base current investigations on. My research is always suggesting that there are nuanced differences, but it's a really good start when we consider human performance in pressurized situations. As sport has done a lot of the groundwork for us, and us as esport coaches and us as esport academics, we have this brilliant opportunity in that. And to make my example, cricket's been around for 200 years and it's not going to change. Esports been around for no time and it's changing right in front of our eyes every single day. Us as support staff, practitioners, players, we get the opportunity to take the best from traditional sport and apply that to esport and leave behind some of the less productive things that come along with traditional sport. And a really good example of that is the research that we do. We don't need to go back to 1970 and make the same mistakes that they made. Well, I wouldn't say mistakes, because science builds on itself, but we can avoid those building blocks and we can kind of start from building on the shoulders of the giants that have come before us in research and in coaching and in talent development. And we can really accelerate how we do things in esport based on the amazing field of traditional sport literature.
Standing on the shoulders of giants, definitely something I think we should all consider. Like our ideas, our thoughts, they're probably inspired by something. If it's not obvious, if we think hard enough, there's probably ideas there that we've borrowed or adapt from other great thinkers and researchers. Just maybe to conclude then, looking forward, like I know there are some big things that have appeared on your radar. Is there anything that you can share about what's coming up for you, Dylan?
Something really exciting has happened in Australia with regards to Australian esports, and it's at the moment been something that I didn't know I was working towards, but that I really had been working towards since Mikey and I started QUT Esports. The Australian Institute of Sport has funded me to develop a conceptual model of esports performance with the hopes that we can adapt the Australian high performance system to build the first gold medal ready esport player. Now, no one has said anything to me of certainty around the next statement, but if we've got the Australian Institute of Sport funding esport specific research, when I say esport, I don't mean the virtual sports that the International Olympic Committee have just announced, which is a great step forward. I know we've got a lot of heat and they should have consulted the esports industry more, because these aren't esports, these are virtual sports or gamified sports. The esports that I'm talking about with the Australian Institute of Sport are your traditional pillars in our community, your LOL, Dota, Overwatch, these traditional games. We also have an Olympics in 2032 coming to Brisbane. So, I'll let others think what they will with that. If in 9 years we've got an Olympics coming to Brisbane and they're funding researchers in Australia to change their high performance system to build the next gold medal ready esport player, fingers crossed what we're all thinking happens. What we are doing, what the Australian Institute of Sport has done here is this is the first esports project they've ever funded, and I'm not sure how many nation states have funded esports performance research before, but this is the Australian Institute of Sport acknowledging that what we do with our traditional sport athletes isn't necessarily going to be the best thing to do with our potential future esport athletes, and we want to get researchers in to help us understand what we need to do to build the best gamers. This is so exciting. I'm so grateful and fortunate to have this opportunity. And I think it's really progressive from the Australian Institute of Sport. I think it's how, as a nation, Australia, that's got just over 22 million people, competes with, from a medal perspective in traditional sport, these giants of the Americas and the Chinas and the European nations to win these gold medals. I think it's this kind of progressive, borderline risk taking on new exciting things and new ways to do things backed by science is why Australia is able to punch above its weight in so many of its international sporting codes. What they're getting us to develop is really simple. It's a small step into the esports industry, and that makes sense because there's going to be a ton of traditional sport enthusiasts in Australia that are going to go, why the hell are you spending AIS money on games? And so it's a small research project. And what they want us to do is three things. They want us to build a model of performance in Australia. So that means asking the best players, coaches, support staff, and like owners and directors, what do you do that makes your players the best in the country? And we'll conduct a bunch of those interviews and they'll make this model. Then we're being funded to chat to the best players in esport, period. So this is going to look like, if we can get proper translations set up, South Korea, Chinese teams, North American teams, and European teams. And we want to understand, what do they do? Those same stakeholders, players, coaches, support staff, and directors, what do they do? And we want to contrast these two models, because essentially what that's saying is, this is where we are, Australia, who doesn't win any international esport tournaments. So why would we expect to win them when they go to the Olympics? This is where we need to get to, and this is the gap. They want me to do that. So what's the gap? Where A to B, what do we need to do to get there? And then they want me to provide an industry report. So i.e. a snapshot of the professional teams, the development pathways, the university, everything that's happening in Australia. And they haven't said this to me, this is now my speculation, but we've seen the AIS do this before where they go, why would we develop something from scratch when it's being done really well in industry and we can support them to do what they're doing better, which will produce us gold medal ready esport athletes. So we're going to build those models and we're going to build the kind of gap to goal. This is where we need to go and how we're going to get there. And hopefully that's the next couple of years of research that I'll be doing. That's undecided. Obviously, they haven't decided to fund that, just the development of those two models and the gap between them. And then I can give them a really clear, this is kind of who's who in the Australian esports zoo. And these are the people we need to empower to keep our esport players progressing. And what I hope this does for coaches and players listening around the world is I hope that other nation states go, well, if Australia's doing it, we better do it. We can't be left behind by little old Australia who's barely got good enough internet to connect to Southeast Asia for international competitions. And what I'm hoping this does is just like QUT Esports spurring on the growth of our university esports scene and subsequently our high school esports scene, I really hope that this spurs on other nation states, other countries to start investing in building their pathways, because then, that's getting one step closer to realizing that dream I had when I was 8 or 9 of, well, I'd love to explore how good I could be. Imagine if there was a junior esport team I could have gone and junior Halo, can you imagine that? It's not didn't have to imagine it now, but back then I did. And so what I'm really hoping is that those 3 things that the Australian Institute of Sport have got me to do really catapults Australia and then the rest of the world forward in terms of their investment in esport research and building great esport players.
Huge.
So excited. I'm so grateful. I'm so excited.
That is so exciting to hear. And I'm so sure it didn't just land on your lap as well. I'm sure this was a shed load of work, a lot of writing, a lot of thinking, a lot of time. So yeah, kudos to you for getting that across the line, man. It's really, really great to hear. And I think you'll do it more than justice. I think you're going to do a phenomenal job sort of, steering the ship on that. Really exciting to announce, and I can't wait to see how that progresses.
I really appreciate that, and hopefully when it's all done, we can have another chat about what we found and what needs to happen going forward and what it all means, and look back on the year that is now till when we have our chat and all this research, next chat and all this research is done.
Yeah, look out for us in the queue of people waiting to talk to you when that takes off.
I'm actually a bit nervous about that, if I'm honest. Much in the same way, Kabir, that you're talking about traditional sports fandom. One thing that most traditional sport fandoms can agree on is that they don't like esports, especially the older generations in Australia. So I'm expecting some heat, and I'll do my best to represent us as an esport industry and community in Australia at a bare minimum.
All right. Well, 9 years until perhaps something happens. 9 years. We can plan the attack there. All right.
I hope so.
I feel like that's bombshell news. It's really exciting news to sort of conclude on. From me, I would say, thank you both for your time. Dylan, thank you so much for sharing your insights. And I feel like the way in which you explain very sometimes complex topics is phenomenal. It's very clear. It really helps. You bring everyone along with you, and you really help everyone understand the depth of these issues and why it's important and how we can use them in our everyday practice. So really, really grateful for you taking the time to join us to do that. Your work is obviously far reaching and impactful, and I'm really looking forward to reading more of it as we go forward. And I hope you can find time to squeeze in a couple of games yourself amongst all of that you've got going on. So thank you for your time. Kabir, any thoughts?
No, just to say thank you. I think I've learned a lot. Psychology is something I've been super fascinated in, just because I always want to know how the brain works, and it's so different from person A to person B, and one event can be perceived so differently by two people, and that comes down to how your brain is wired, right? And listening to Dylan talk about it, especially in a competitive sense, helps me understand myself better. So now I know when I go into solo queue, I'm not going to be slamming my table, being like, team, focus. I can just focus on myself. hit that Zen mode and be like, okay, every game, just focus on my own ability. Maybe not mute all. Maybe that's not the best if I want to become a professional, but don't take it to heart if my team isn't performing, because that ultimately is out of my control. So for me, a personal development session personally, this podcast has been.
Think about your resources.
You guys are too kind.
Brilliant. Okay, well, we'll conclude it there. So thanks for everyone being here today, and thanks for everyone listening. Please feel free to interact and comment with anything you'd like to. And Dylan will post all of your links, socials, a couple of your papers there, so that everyone can find you easily and interact with your work. So, yeah, looking forward to that next conversation. Adios.